Right. Welcome to Peace On, your source for inspiring conversation and information from thought leaders across the spectrum of topics related to the strategies of building peace, fostering nonviolence, shifting our understanding towards empathy, compassion, and connection, and creating a world that thrives for everyone. Today, we're joined by Jeremy Solomons, and Jeremy will be sharing today about the 10 steps that lead to genocide and the 10 steps that lead to peace and reconciliation, using Rwanda as an example. And Jeremy has a pretty lengthy bio, so he's going to introduce himself with the things that are most important for him to share, and then we'll get into the presentation. So Jeremy, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be with you wherever you are in the world, or whatever time you're listening or watching this. I'm actually right now in the hills of Kigali in Rwanda, which is a small country in East Africa that many of you may know suffered a horrendous genocide nearly 30 years ago, when up to 1 million people were killed in just over 3 months. Even though the genocide had been a long time coming, still it was something that shocked the world. And there have been many articles, books written about it, a lot of people trying to analyze what happened, what went wrong. And on the good side is that Rwanda has done a really fantastic job in terms of reunifying, reconciling, rebuilding after that genocide. And today is one of the fastest growing economies, not just in Africa, but in the world. It was one of the safest countries during COVID, for example. Very peaceful, very safe. Kigali is the safest city in Africa and the 7th safest in the world. So Rwanda is a very different place now from what it was 30 years ago, but it can also teach us many lessons as well. And for me, as you can maybe tell from my accent, originally I am from the UK, from England, from Manchester, and I grew up in the post-Holocaust, post-World War II period in England, when there was a great consciousness again about another human tragedy of what happened during the Second World War and before. So I grew up in that period of trying to understand what happened. How did the Nazi movement come to power? What did it do? What were the repercussions? And then now, many years later, seeing some similarities between what happened in pre-World War II Germany with what happened here in Rwanda, and more importantly, is what the implications are for the world now. Kathy, you just talked about the importance of a world that thrives for everyone. Not everyone is thriving right now. And so at a time of great conflict, violence, war, in certain parts of the world, combined with climate change, starvation, drought, flooding, you name it. It's important to be able to see where we are as societies and what we can do to be able to deal with some of the social repercussions of insecurity, of hatred, of division. And so if we can have a look first at a model called the Continuum of Violence, if we can project that on the screen. This was developed by a Hungarian psychologist. His name is Ervin Staub, and he was born in Hungary, but spent most of his professional career in the US, a lot of it at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And he developed this continuum of violence. There are steps in it, and as you can see, hopefully, and those of you may be listening, I'll describe it to you. It describes basically how a society, a culture, a country can descend from social cohesion to social destruction, and basically to the point of the failure of a state, which is what happened certainly here in Rwanda, and has happened elsewhere and could happen in other countries. So what he did was to look at these 10 stages, which I'll go through with you very briefly. First of all, very often such movements, deconstruction can begin with something that can happen in many, many different societies. So the way he describes it, increased insecurity, economic, political, or social, the starting point for the development of hostility against a certain group. So a key part of this is kind of the in-group and out-group, about who's in power, who's not in power, who the aggrieved is, and who the perceived benefactors of society's privileges are. So a lot of it is around perception, maybe rather than reality. But again, if we think about the Holocaust and what happened here in Rwanda, certainly in this case, and I'll talk about Rwanda more, you had the majority Hutu who were very resentful of the power that the minority Tutsis had, which was largely a colonial legacy, that the Belgians, very briefly, what they did was that they favored the minority Tutsis, gave them plum positions in government, for example. And one of the reasons they did this, which may sound a little bit laughable, was that in general, they tended to be thinner, more angular, more European looking, even though they had darker skin. And so the picture was for the majority Hutu, who are about 80%, that why are these minorities getting this privileged treatment? Why are they getting things that we don't get? And a lot of it was perception rather than reality, but it created this division. Combined with that, one of the things the Belgians did, which had never happened here in this very peaceful country, was they basically people had to have national identity cards with their ethnicity stamped into it. So you're either Hutu or a Tutsi. There is another ethnic group called the Twa, who tend to be further to the northwest in the mountains. So it's primarily between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And so this was the start of this social division and what led to the second stage of in-grouping, who feels part of the power group, who feels outside, and leaders emerging within that take advantage of this division to be able to point out, look at what the others are doing. Part of that is number 3, social polarization and scapegoating. So blaming their problems on this particular group, in this case, the Tutsis, it's all their problems. So they were called names such as cockroaches or snakes, which are both derogatory terms here in Rwanda, are basically dehumanizing them, blaming them for all the things that were wrong within society. Number 4 is discrimination, where apart from just blaming, the outgroup is actually discriminated against in terms of getting jobs, getting places in university, getting housing. So some of that's kind of more active action against that outgroup than in this case with the Tutsis. Number 5, this ideology grows, and where people start to justify their positions, it becomes something that is much more established of. It's not just that, we're one group and we hate the other group, but this is part of the identity of who we are, is that we are superior, they are inferior, they don't deserve any kind of fair treatment because they're less than us. Number 6 is absence of active bystanders, people who see what's going on, but then don't take any action. And in this case, a lot of it was the foreign powers. So you had the colonial powers of Belgium and to a lesser extent France, who were never a formal colonial power, but they were involved here. And then international organizations like the United Nations that were present here, could see what was going on, but they didn't take action. To a lesser extent, other countries like the US and UK, and President Bill Clinton apologized. Many years later, the UN apologized, the UK, Tony Blair apologized. But at the time, they were not really active bystanders. They knew what was going on. There were some reports, there were some people like Colonel Dallaire of the United Nations who did try to warn Kofi Annan and others that something bad was about to happen, and then even when it did happen, but was largely ignored. So unfortunately, that only enables the people taking the power that to be able to do more if people that could possibly take a stand, could possibly do something, the bystanders, if they were upstanders, but in this case, unfortunately, too many of them were passive bystanders. They didn't do enough. Then just an increase, a snowballing where you get manipulation and propaganda, and in this case, the media was dominated by the Hutus in those days, largely radio. Obviously, this is in the days before social media. So it was largely radio. There was one particular radio station, Mokoline, that was run by Finance Kabuga, who was recently caught in France after many years on the run and has recently been declared unfit to be able to stand trial, that he has dementia, he's in his late 80s. So, but these were the people that were manipulating the media to be able to reinforce this message of these cockroaches, snakes, etc., subhumans that are a threat to society that need to be taken care of. Number 8 was just acts of violence. So people started, it was more on individual levels, there were acts of violence. There were people that were shot, killed around the country, different places, but with a certain level of impunity that people didn't do anything to stop it. And so there was that feeling generally of intimidation, violence. You'd better keep your place, you better keep a low profile because we're going to come and get you. Those kind of warnings that were issued is, you know, you're next, we're going to get you. So that's number 8. Number 9 is then when the violence starts. That this dehumanization, demonization leads to actual persecution and violence in a fairly organized way. And so even though we wouldn't recommend you watch the movie Hotel Rwanda, it does show at a certain stage. And the reason for that actually is because there are a lot of inaccuracies there, particularly the hero, Paul Rusesabagina, is portrayed as a hero. He wasn't a hero at all. He was a small-time crook who was just an opportunist and managed to wangle his way into a job at the Hotel Michelin, but he made a lot of money from it and was very cruel in the way that he treated people, discriminated between those who had money and those who didn't. But the movie does show a scene where you can see a whole load of machetes, these large, long knives that are traditionally used in agriculture. And that was all planned. So the spark for the genocide was the downing of a plane that contained the president at the time, Habimana, that on April 6, 1994, and then the genocide started properly April 7th, but it had been well planned. And so then people just had the green light to be able to go out and commit mass murder all around the country. And a key thing about this, which a lot of people don't realize that maybe is different from the Holocaust. In the Holocaust, it was a particular group of trained soldiers, militias with uniforms very often, who were carrying out maybe the atrocities, whether it was within the concentration camps or out on the streets, persecution, violence, shooting people, etc. Here, it wasn't, there were militia, but there wasn't anybody in uniform per se. It was just citizen on citizen, sometimes villager on villager, neighbor on neighbor, even members of the same family. And so the violence was much more widespread and much more deep and integrated within the society. It wasn't a kind of special elite against them. It was really citizen on citizen. And then that led to the extreme insecurity, led to the genocide, the extermination, as I said, of nearly 1 million people in 3 months. So Rwanda went through this whole process. It took, in all, people will put a different starting point. Most people will say it started in the late 50s. So we're looking at something like 35 years for this whole process to play out. As I said, it was well planned. It wasn't something that happened overnight. So it does take time. And there are warning posts along the way. And then going back to number 6, the absence of active bystanders, there were plenty of signals for those governments, international agencies to be able to see what's going on and try to protect against it, and nowhere near enough was done. So that's continuum of violence. That's what happened here in Rwanda. Kathy, any questions about that before we go on to the?
I think that was pretty clear. So there's the in group and the out group. The bystanders do nothing. In this case, was mostly the nations. The media plays a large role in it. Individuals start carrying out violence, and then it becomes planned and organized, and genocide happens. And it did take time for this to happen. You're saying there were a lot of places to intervene. So I'm going to put up the continuum of benevolence. Let me just get this wide on the screen, and we can go into
doing this.
Yes.
While you're doing this, let me just stress it. The powers that be, the Hutu powers that be, created an environment in which it was okay for individuals to be able to commit acts of violence and persecution, terror. It wasn't spontaneous. It was allowed, it was permitted, it was even encouraged for people to do it. So that, again, is a big difference perhaps with the Holocaust. It wasn't so much officialdom persecuting people. It was anybody was given permission to do that. It was somewhat anarchic. It was kind of controlled anarchy, if you like.
Yeah. All right, let me put up the next continuum. Continuum of benevolence.
So here, this is the second model again, that was inspired by the work of Staub, constructed by Thomas Vincent Flores. And then the other organization mentioned is Aegis Trust, which runs the Kigali Genocide Memorial, and they do a lot of really wonderful work around education of what actually happened here before, during, and after the genocide. And then more importantly, again, that process of reconciliation, reunification, and rebuilding. And what they do, for example, is they have developed this wonderful peace education program, which is mandatory part of the educational curriculum for most students around the country. They go around villages, they lead dialogues about, again, what happened, how to make sure it never happens again. They have been a very important kind of center, but also sponsor of this work around what's called the Continuum of Benevolence, but basically how do you reconstruct a society after such a horror of what happened. And this applies again to other societies that have been riven by internal strife. So right now, obviously, a lot of focus of the world is on Ukraine. That's a bit different because you have a foreign power that is coming in, trying to take over the country. Yet the national center has so far held within Ukraine in terms of repelling this invader. Here, it came from within. And what is particularly interesting about this continuum of benevolence, which I will go through as well, is that it's more on the individual level, that whereas the degradation was more on the institutional, societal level, and certainly Rwanda has paid a lot of attention to, for example, government policies that have, as some of you may have heard, have, for example, focused on women's education and empowerment, because traditionally young women did not finish their education. They were not allowed or encouraged to go into the workplace, whereas that has all changed. That's just one of many government policies that has allowed the country to rebuild, to be able to tap a very much underutilized resource in terms of women being an active part of society. And the result is that now Rwanda has the most women in parliament of any country in the world. It's about 61%. 6 out of the 16 bank CEOs, top bank CEOs, are all women. So there have been some institutional governmental actions which have helped towards the social reconstruction, certainly. Another example is the practice of umuganda, in terms of every last Saturday of the month in the morning, the whole country shuts down, no work is done, there is no traffic on the streets. Everybody is in their village or neighborhood or street. They come together, they do community work together. So it might be cleaning the streets, it might be fixing the gutters of an old person or painting their house. And then they might have a meeting and a meal afterwards. So that again is another example of how the country's taken an old practice of umuganda and they've made a modern version of it to be able to again bring people back together in community. And I'm not aware of that happening on a national basis in any other country in the world. So there have been those societal, governmental, community actions. Here, this community continuum of benevolence focuses on the individual, each individual who survived the genocide, coming from a place of what they call indifference at the beginning. So they may have quite a lot of fear, mistrust, anger, resentment at this stage, and it can take a while. You know, if you've lost your loved ones, and so if I can give an example, my wife is Rwandan. She lost her father and 3 brothers in the genocide, has never really known them. And so not so much her, but her mother certainly, who lost her husband and 3 sons, you know, she was very angry, not surprisingly, very fearful. And even to this day, nearly 30 years later, she might hear a car backfire outside the house, and immediately she thinks that there's gunshots, and she'll go and hide. So that trauma that comes out of that extreme violence is still there, and it's still there for many Rwandans, whether they suffered it directly or maybe it's through their families. If you have read any studies about trauma that gets passed on from generation to generation. So here, there does seem to be, I'm not an expert in that area, but it does seem to be a lot of generational trauma that people have got it passed on from their parents, grandparents. And, you know, just as a simple example that I learned fairly early on here is, whereas, you know, when you get to meet people for the first time, you know, one of the questions you ask, you don't ask about the weather here because the weather's always the same, it's always beautiful, but you might ask about the family. You know, how's your family? And you don't do that here because the chances are that people's family, even close family, may not be alive. So you don't really want to, you know, get into that kind of conversation before you get to know someone. I met somebody who had lost 68 members of their family in the genocide. And I watched a video one time where somebody had lost 150 members of their family. And if you think about it, I'm not sure about you, but I would have tremendous problems even naming 150 members of my family. But here people are very conscious about family, community, ancestry, lineage. And so it in a way, it hurts even more that when you know your family, when there are many family, village, community celebrations, to lose that number of people, can you imagine the grief, horror, and again, quite justified anger that might come from that? So that's where people had to start, those who survived at whatever age. Some were, you know, children, some were in their teens, some, you know, middle-aged, some older, wherever people were. So it took time. For many people, it took years, but gradually over time, the second stage is of opening up, of just being open up to listen to other stories, explanations, what people did. Not immediately, but in the 2000s, Rwanda started up a series of community tribunals, which again was an ancient practice here, similar to the truth and reconciliation process that you may know about in South Africa, where people would basically come in front of their peers, in front of their village elders. And first of all, if they're a perpetrator, they had to admit to their crimes fully, and then beg forgiveness. So had to show genuine remorse, beg forgiveness, and then the elders would decide what was appropriate punishment. For some egregious crimes, they had to go to prison, some were expelled, others did community service, but there was a focus on trying to rehabilitate people, at least hearing the stories. And for many people, you might imagine that was very painful, but for many people, it was actually healing to know what happened to your family member that disappeared. My wife talks of how she and her sisters would wait on the gate regularly because they still believed when they were young that their father was coming home. So to have that finality, however painful it was a very important part of the healing, to just listen to other people's story, even if you still felt hatred, to be able to say, okay, at least now I know what happened. And then that can lead, hopefully, number 3 is acceptance of, okay, I can accept what happened, however painful it was. At least I can hear what they're saying. And that is step 3 on the way back to social reconstruction, of just accepting what happened and not feeling that there's some outcome, or, the tremendous anger about the injustice and the violence and the terrific loss that happened to so many people in so many ways. So no, the number 3. Number 4 is about respect, and being able to even respect other people's point of view and be respected in return. After such tremendous disrespect, that respect had to go both ways, of being able to see each other, respect each people's point of view, even perhaps if you don't agree with them. Maybe you don't feel they're sincere, but at least respecting people's right to be heard, and treating people with dignity is an important part of this healing process. Number 5 is a stage further of actual empathy or compassion, in terms of being able to understand sharing the feelings of another. And, particularly where somebody is genuinely remorseful, is willing to own up to what they did. And another key piece of this is having empathy for the children of those perpetrators, because in a way they're innocent, yet they're obviously stained by maybe their parents' actions. And so having empathy for them as well, in terms of understanding, basically seeing the humanity beneath the mask of terror. Number 6 is going beyond the empathy to caring, actually having service for others, displaying kindness and concern. So that's another level beyond empathy, not just feeling, but actually acting on it. Connection, number 7, is when a person feels a positive relationship to someone and finding an area of commonality. And it could be something as simple as having a common love of painting. And there are places here in Rwanda, they're called reconciliation villages, where people literally were killing each other 30 years ago, but they've come back together. They're mixing with each other again. And even, in terms of connection, they're even intermarrying again, that it's been possible to do that. And so that's, an example of a positive relationship where people can rebuild, can come together again and try to put the past behind them. Maybe not forget the past, but at least to forgive the past. Number 8 is community again, of the community coming together, of having that sense of belonging. So one thing that struck me, from very early on, I first started coming here 7 years ago to do work, was maybe having a conversation with a taxi driver. And after a while, after a few days of being driven, you start to have more intimate conversations. And I remember one who said to me very bluntly, my father was Hutu, my mother was Tutsi, but I'm a Rwandan now. And so that idea of this process, which the government started, called Ndi Umuntu Rwanda, which means I'm a Rwandan, this idea of Rwandan identity, community identity. And again, the practice of Umuganda that I mentioned earlier, the community service, helps with this, where people come together and see a kind of bigger, fresher, newer goal that brings people together beyond the divisions, which the only positive you can see of that they were created by the Belgians, that they didn't really exist before the Belgian occupation. And after the genocide, they disappeared. The ID cards disappeared, obviously. So because it was a relatively short period within Rwanda's history, people were able to come back to a sense of community again. And obviously, as in Germany, people don't talk about Hutus or Tutsis, except in the historical context. You would not go up to someone and say, are you Hutu or Tutsi? I mean, people might say, well, I can tell whether someone is Hutu and Tutsi, and people might be a bit cautious at first of not knowing whether they're Hutu or Tutsi, but it's not a subject of conversation. It's not on a job application. It's not on a school application. So that sense of community has been very important. And the government has done a really incredible job in terms of that, being able to rebuild that on all levels, whether it's a village level, whether it's city level or country level as well. Number 9 is what is described as love, deep feeling, compassion, trust, caring, giving towards others, including things like marriage, community service, charitable works. And then 10 is what described as peace, harmonious relations, free disturbance, conflict, anxiety, attention. As I said, there is generational trauma. So I don't think you could describe the whole country at peace. There still are feelings of nervousness that particularly come out in April of every year, which is the national commemoration of called Kwibuka, of remembering what happened in the genocide. So superficially, the country is peaceful. As I said, it's very safe. There is an army which actually is more involved with peacekeeping missions in other countries such as Mozambique and Central African Republic. So there is that sense of peace, which, again, if you compare it with other countries, is probably much greater. There isn't, yes, there is a police presence, military presence around, particularly in Kigali, but it's a sense of peacemaking. There's not, I've been in other countries, I used to be a journalist, where there's a kind of threat to it, intimidation. It doesn't feel like that here. And I fully admit, as an empowered white foreigner, obviously I'm in a different position. I wasn't going to be arrested during COVID because I wasn't wearing my mask right, whereas our housekeeper was. So there is that element, but just in general, there is that feeling of we're at peace, things are tranquil, particularly given what happened here 30 years ago. So it's about as peaceful as you can get. Yeah. And that's something which I think has implications, particularly for the US. And if, Kathy, you would like me to speak about that more, I'm happy to do so.
What you've just said is so beautiful and moving. I'm very moved by the peace and reconciliation process in Rwanda. I'm so grateful that you're getting this information out there. It's so important to know. And yes, I think another time we could talk more about that. But the Fumaganda, can you spell that for me?
Sorry, Umuganda. So it's
Umuganda.
UMUGANDA.
Great.
Umuganda.
Yeah, it's a beautiful practice that's happening in Rwanda. I had no idea. I know people who listen to this will have no idea of the beauty of the peace and reconciliation process that's happened and is happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we could leave it there unless there's anything else you want to say. I want to stay in this place of love and beauty that you've just molded for us.
No, I didn't time it, so it's kind of interesting. It was about half an hour, I think. No?
Yeah, we're at time, so I'll just say goodbye to the audience and we can chat for a few minutes. I'm going to turn off the recording.